I shall just give everyone like 10 seconds to get in and out so that we're not too disrupted. Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Johnston. I'm the Chief Technology Officer of a startup based in London. We are the company's called Movivo. We're an interesting company. And we do various things around mobile apps, and we have a fully serverless back end. So about 18 months ago, I joined the company, and I decided that I wanted to do things a little bit differently. I think I was a little bit mad, because what I did was I decided to have absolutely no servers. I wanted to see if you could do a startup without any servers whatsoever. So I went with AWS Lambda, because it was the only option out there at the time. And you know, my background was that I've been doing startups, and I've been doing various things for a while with technology and things like Django apps, Rails apps, the kind of things you normally think about. So servers. I started off 20 years ago as a Linux sysadmin. Just out of interest, is there anyone here who's under the age of 20? No? Okay, that's good. That makes me feel better. I'm not that old then. What we did was I decided to start doing everything with Lambda. And starting to do everything with Lambda is quite fun, because no one's done it before you, so you kind of have to make it all up as you're going along. And we've evolved our approach over time. Our understanding of Lambda has changed over time. We started off with a kind of a normal N-tier approach. So, you know, you've got your data and your service and your various layers, and you understand how that all works. But we've kind of moved away from that to something a little bit more event-driven and understood. And I'm kind of going to go through that from the point of view of understanding the value that it gives us. And while not everything is to do with money, when you're a CTO, you're responsible for a number of things. You're responsible for the business side of things, and you're responsible for the technology. So you've got two different hats that you've got to think about. And I've been involved with a number of different startups, mainly as a consultant before this job. And one of the things that I found was that, yes, you can take your Django and your Rails and your various other frameworks and tools, and you can build something, and it works. And the first time it starts working, and everything's fine, and everything's brilliant. And then, after about 6 months, someone says, oh, we need to upgrade this, or, oh, the servers are now doing this, or someone hacks something, and you've got to put a security patch in. And what I found was that over time, the longer something is stale, for want of a better phrase, the more that you have to look after it, the more that you have to maintain it. And so when I was looking at Lambda, and I was looking at it from a point of view of cost, I really was thinking about it from the point of view of, can I just reduce my maintenance down to the absolute minimum? Now, you know, you're never going to get it perfect, but that's pretty much what the idea was when we started. And bear in mind, I started 20 years ago managing servers, and trust me, we've got it very, very easy now to when we had it back then. So this is kind of how we used to do it. We used to have physical boxes. We used to have these actual things that went into racks. Now, most people don't have those now. They have some form of virtual server or an instance, or if you're a little bit clever, you'll have some kind of managed instance, like, you know, a Heroku or something like that. Or if you're really nice, you've got containers, because that's the cool thing to do now, if you listen to certain people. The thing is about all of these things is that they're all servers. They're all the same thing underneath it. They're all, you might not be able to SSH into all of them in exactly the same way, but they're all essentially the same problem. And the technology that has come out over the last 15 years has been essentially the same thing. Now, that might not be a problem. And the thing is that if you've got a Django framework, or, you know, I did Django, I just keep on mentioning Django, sorry. You know, you've got your frameworks, they work, they do a certain thing for you, but they are a server solution. They're not something made for Lambda. And one of the arguments I've heard is, well, it's a known problem and it's a solved problem. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the best thing to do. And from a less is more approach, you actually still end up maintaining something at the end of the day. Although with your normal apps that we've done for years and years and years, in terms of CTOs, it's a known thing. It's fine, it's okay, it's good. And it's relatively easy to cost, and it's relatively easy to maintain, but it doesn't mean that you don't have cost. The catch is that actually you have to manage it. They're your servers. There's still everything there that you have to do, and the maintenance is the bit that causes the problem, and I'm kind of going over it. But the one thing I remember is how many people have run servers that have been hacked? Okay, I'm thinking that's about half of you, and the other half are mostly lying. So, so the point is that you still have to maintain things. You still have to look after them. The security patches, you can never do them fast enough. You can never actually, you will always at some point be hacked. And the other part of it is that you've almost always got some kind of monolithic code base. So you can do your development and you can do your things, you can build your development on your own computer and launch it up, and it's absolutely fine, and except when it goes down because your dev environment is different to your live environment. But the really interesting part of all of this is actually with the developers. I think you end up with a significant amount of entrenched thinking. I think we've had 15 years of this is how you do it, and it's been an iteration, and it's been small iterations on the this is how you do it. And now we've got to a point of Lambda is different. Serverless is different. And it requires different thinking. So kind of the next step we're going to is now not doing servers. And the problem with that is that actually makes developers very nervous because they don't really know what they're talking about. It does actually increase complexity. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. And you have more intricacies, and more things are dealt with outside of code. So your developers have to start thinking of your infrastructure as well, so Devops changes. When you talk about supplier as well, you are more reliant on your supplier. If you're choosing a supplier who's new, they're just down the road, they say they're a cloud provider, and they do all of these things. There's 3 men and a dog, and they've all got beards and like coffee, and they are called Hipster Cloud. Then you're all right. They're going to be there for the next 10 years, aren't they? Or are they? That's another thing. But with what we found is that the maintenance becomes a problem with infrastructure. You're managing and maintaining infrastructure rather than managing and maintaining code, and it's just a different problem. So we're talking about the business case a little bit. Serverless is still very new. We've had a few pioneers in the field, and we've got a few providers giving us some solutions to work with. And I think at the moment we're still in the phase of trying to figure out how this really works, what are the patterns that work, where the value really lies in terms of what kinds of things are worth doing and what kinds of things aren't. I actually asked the question of a few people at lunchtime, when would you never use serverless? When would you not use it? How would you do it? And actually there are very few scenarios that we could think of that you couldn't use some sort of serverless approach. And it was just an interesting problem. The problem that we do have with the business case is that there aren't very many people doing it at scale. I mean, my company, Movivo, has been going 18 months. I can tell you, what can I tell you? I can tell you that our total AWS bill in that 18 months is less than $5,000. And I can point at companies that are our age and have that much monthly billing. So, I think when you look at it from that point of view, we're a pioneer. We can say that. You won't necessarily do the same things, and you won't necessarily get the same result. But I think there's some compelling reasons to look at this. So, where is the business case? So I have a bunch of CTOs that I talk to in London. That's where we're from. I am probably still a little jet-lagged because I only got here at 4:30 yesterday, and it's a 6-hour time difference. But one of the questions I asked them is, what would you like to know about when we're talking about serverless? And there were lots of really good questions. And what I've decided to do is kind of take those questions, turn them around, and talk about different parts and try to give you the pros and the cons, or at least the old to the new approach a little bit. So let's kind of start off on that one. So function as a service is it's still quite a new idea. Depending on who you talk to, it's an old idea. But I think from the world that we're coming from, I think it's still quite new. It's not a simple analog. There's no kind of simple way of going, this is how we used to do it, and this is serverless. It's a big change. And as one of my friends says, serverless functions and functions as a service are a little bit like crack. You kind of start them and then you just can't get off them. You're a bit stuck. Basically, if you don't want to try it, don't start, or you're going to be stuck. And we are actually still in a pioneering phase with it. I don't think that we've even reached a point where we know what serverless is going to look like in 5 years' time. I think the ideas are still molding around. Some benefits are that we've got cost is significant. I think if you understand how to do these things and really try and make an effort to use some of the practices that are going around at the moment, cost is definitely one area which makes a big, big difference. Your functions decouple your logic from each other, which sounds like a problem, but actually it's a really good thing because it forces you to think in a more distributed way. And distributed thinking is not completely straightforward, and a lot of developers find it quite hard to think in a distributed way. But once you start going down that route, everything becomes distributed in your head, and it makes a lot more sense when you start doing it. But it is that there is a disconnect between how we do things at the moment. Another area that kind of has been quite key and is not always completely thought about is that when you've got a server and you're running a server and then something goes wrong on it and it just takes the server down, everything's gone. All of your functions are gone. Every single one now doesn't work because your server doesn't work. If your errors are contained because your functions are small and only that function errors, in fact, you don't even necessarily lose that function because the thing can fail, another container might start up with your function, and it might still work because of the stateless nature. Now, it does also allow massive scale, which is kind of the one reason it's really nice, but the other part of it is no bulky frameworks. Part of the value of serverless that we've found is that function as a service will, if you make sure that your code is small, it loads fast, it's a really valuable tool in your arsenal because you can create functions and features very quickly. So I think there's a lot of value in it. It's still not perfected. We still don't quite know where it's going, but there is, in terms of a business value, the cost is the biggest thing. So we've talked a little bit about distribution and distributed things. You do need events and queues. You need some kind of way of managing how things run and when things run. I know this is kind of talking about all the various different aspects of serverless, but trying to bring out the business side of it a little bit. It feels like a backward step, actually. Just out of interest, how many people here have worked on hardware problems? So a few of you. How many of you were working on them 30 years ago? Not very many. The reason I ask that is because I've been to a couple of conferences and given a couple of talks where people have come up to me and said, all those things you're talking about, they're actually solved problems from hardware 30 years ago. And I was sitting there going, I've never heard any of this stuff. But actually, there are distributed, there's books on distributed thinking from 30 years ago that were talking about hardware. And it talks about how you plan and develop these tools around it. And I think there's something, I think we kind of need to rediscover a little bit of the old school thinking in that. And I think it's worth, talk to the iRobot guys. I'm sure someone there will know something about this kind of thing. Well, hopefully, they build robots after all. But one of the really good things about events and queues is that you begin to think asynchronous by default. And actually, most people don't. Most developers don't. Most developers still think synchronous. They still think procedural, actually. One of the, I don't know quite what I meant by that next bit, hot swappable fans. I think I've just put a typo. So one of the really interesting functions, that was it. One of the really interesting things is if you're using events and queues and you find that there is a function that fails or is going wrong or is problematic, you're not taking your entire system down and repurposing your entire system. You can actually just replace one thing, and that one thing can then change how your entire system works. It actually makes it also quite straightforward to change your entire flow, because you change one function to point at something else, or you point it to a different event, or whatever it is. And I think this is actually the secret sauce of how function as a service works. I think you can't think about function as a service and you can't think about events without considering data within the serverless place. Now, most people thinking is relational databases first, and often when they're, and this is old school thinking again, you're thinking frameworks, you're thinking ORMs. Now, I've come across a bunch of people who think that data management requires an ORM because they don't know what SQL is. And actually what we've got is we've got abstractions and complexity in the way that we do things now, which seem to make it simpler, but actually what it means is that the people who are doing these things don't fully understand what's going on underneath, and that's kind of problematic for me. And when you've got events that force distributed thinking, you're actually forcing yourself to go with a more data-driven design, and that's quite difficult to do, but it adds value later on. So what we found is that we actually store a lot less. It's a lot easier to manage. It's a lot easier to back up your data. It's a lot easier to consider encryption because you're not trying to do all these clever things. Relational data is not necessarily what you want in all circumstances, and understanding when to use it and when not is quite important. So you have to kind of rethink, because the frameworks give you all of these problems. You have to rethink. Now, it's more complicated to do this. It's definitely more complicated to do this, but I think you get a value in maintenance at the end of it, and refactoring and migrating is easier. So I think that the cost, again, comes as a concept of time and maintenance. So infrastructure, yeah, I've already said servers, they're all servers previously, and you've got your security patches, you've got to maintain them, and then they're just problematic. Testing environments, containers. Yes, containers allow you to create something on your dev environment and push it up, but actually you still can't ever know that exactly what you've got in your dev environment is going to be your live environment. So I think developers are too reliant upon their own machines and their own thinking, and it works on my machine, to really consider the operations, whereas I think DevOps changes with serverless because you've got to go with infrastructure as code all the way through. You've got to really think about that first, and you've got to think about, as a developer, you've got to think about the moving parts of your system. So it's a more difficult thing to think about as a development problem, and yes, it becomes harder to test, because the only way you can really do that is by setting up your entire system in a new, for us, AWS account. So we have two AWS accounts, one that tells us exactly whether everything's working, and the production one, and we set them both up using the same infrastructure as code with a slightly different config. Now, interestingly, one of the things I thought was going to be difficult has actually turned out to be really straightforward. We have a guy who's just joined us about 6 weeks ago. He'd never touched AWS before. He was quite junior. He'd only done a couple of years in tech. Hadn't really been, given the responsibility to do much more than do some code and to understand what was going on. We brought him in, showed him the AWS console for about a day, have a bit of a play with a bit of a test account, understand it. And then we showed him our Terraform scripts and said, understand these. And it took him a couple of days to understand what was going on. But now, 6 weeks later, he doesn't really use the AWS console except for the metrics. He only uses the Terraform scripts to create new features, to add new things in. And he's almost better at it than I am, because he's not got that weight of all of this stuff behind him. And I've been quite surprised at how different the thinking is, but how easy it is for probably people who are younger, who do not have that background, to actually pick up. So I think there's a real benefit in bringing people on board, and certainly younger people with good skills are actually probably more likely to do something here. I'm going to kind of keep pushing a little harder because I'm not going to get through all my slides otherwise. Okay. So security. It's a constant challenge. We know the server approach. We know how things are done. We know how to lock down servers, and we still have SSH. We still have all of these other things. But they're still our servers. But there are lots of tools out there to help them. Now, have you ever considered the fact that actually we put these servers out there, and then all these tools that then allow us to keep those servers and do the same things, but actually we're just building tooling on tooling to stop things that could be changed by going to a serverless environment. There's a lot of time and energy put into this, and a lot of time means people cost. When you're a CTO, you want to reduce that significantly. And so when you've got a serverless way of going about things, your provider is responsible for patching all your servers, your code bases are smaller. There is a problem in the fact that actually your service provider may have access to your data. So if that's a real problem, consider it. Create a service of some sort where you've got encrypted data somewhere else, and that can be done. But you get so many benefits. Again, someone said earlier, basically don't try and do things that Amazon can do for you. Why would you? So I think security is, I do understand people saying, on-prem and all of these other things, but what's the balance of value here? I still think if you can get your providers to provide you those things, and it doesn't, you're not breaking laws by doing so, then it's probably a better thing to do. So deployment. Devops is a fantastic term. I think actually what it means is you have operations people and developers and someone in the middle who makes sure that they don't annoy each other. And I think part of the problem we have is that developers don't take enough responsibility for building their own, for understanding the infrastructure and the operations. I think they're very good at saying, well, it works on my machine. I don't know what you've done, but it works for me. And I think part of the problem we have at the moment is that we don't have those kinds of tools for this. We have a few, and there are more tools coming on, but actually most of them are for deployment of functions, not for the serverless as a whole. And I think we need that to change to make more sense. At the moment, you kind of have to roll your own infrastructures, and you kind of have to roll your own ideas and deployment tools, and I think that's a problem. But if you can get your developers to consider the idea of considering the infrastructure, so you're not just saying to them, write me some code that does all these 14 things, but it's write me some, one Lambda function that does X, that then points to an event stream, that then sends an event to another Lambda function, which then fans out to 3 more, and it's all asynchronous, and because you don't have to worry about things going back to wherever, you can do it in various different ways, and you can make it reusable. So we have, within our infrastructure, for example, we have one way of updating a user's credits within the system. And if we want to add users' credits, we create a single event wherever we are in the entire system that adds users' credits to the system. We just have that we can reuse as code. Normally you would do that within a library of some description or an object or whatever. But this way, it means that it's part of our infrastructure, and we can, if that one thing is going wrong, we can fix that one thing. And that deployment scenario in that case is that we can change that one thing, and it goes through a whole process. I've kind of talked about the wrong thing there, but I think there's room for improvement within these tools at the moment, within this kind of area. But I think we'll find out what's going on. Now, quick point on testing. I think testing is very much a solved problem in terms of the server way of doing things and the old school way of doing things. And I think from a CTO's point of view, it's actually we can test to our heart's content, and it'll work, and it'll be absolutely fine. I think developers over-rely on it. I think developers hand over responsibility to the tests for things working, and I think actually I would like, as a CTO, more developers to take responsibility. When you're talking about serverless, unit testing is easy, everything else is hard at the moment. We don't really have good tools for doing this. It's quite difficult to make sure that you've got your entire system working. And I think if you don't have an infrastructure as code solution, I think you're struggling even more. But to be honest, unit testing gets you an awful long way. The people, I think I've kind of covered this earlier. I think if you've got smaller code bases, it's easier to get your people to understand one piece of, one Lambda function. So if a Lambda function goes down, even if you haven't looked at it for a year, unless you've got 700 lines, 1,000 lines of code, which you probably shouldn't have, we stick to about 150, 200 maximum, then you should be able to pick it up and understand it, even if you haven't seen it before. That's the idea that we go with. And as I said, we found it easier to onboard people, and I think people become more productive more quickly, which for a CTO is a really good thing. It doesn't necessarily mean that they would be as productive as the other way, but I've found that mostly if you have to learn the entire code base of something before you can really make any changes, people are more likely to make problems, and more likely to ask lots of questions that they don't need to. And I think there's benefits in that. A quick kind of point on vendor lock-in. Yes, if you're doing a container or server-based solution, then you can actually move providers relatively easily. It's not completely straightforward. They're pretty much the same everywhere. But with a serverless environment, you kind of have to think about who your providers are a little bit more carefully. And I think from a CTO point of view, you are kind of putting your eggs in a basket. Certainly if you're a young startup and you're trying one thing, you really just have to go with one. You just have to go, right, we're going with AWS or we're going with Microsoft, and you just have to get on with it. And the providers provide you with some of the analytics and logging, but actually you really still need some of the best-of-breed stuff there as well. And you can get that if you need it. But they give you really good stuff most of the time. If they didn't, you wouldn't use it. So I don't like the idea of vendor lock-in. No one ever does. But if you're a startup, you really don't have a choice. But if you're a big company then as long as you've got infrastructure as code, you can work around that. So maintenance. Again, with your servers, it's kind of a known problem. You kind of know what you've got to do, and you've got to have operational people on standby who can fix everything. And that's how it works. When you've got your service provider basically doing all of the bits that would require people for, you still have problems, you still have things that you have to fix, but mostly you're fixing a small bit of your code base at any one time rather than the whole thing. And I think as long as you've got infrastructure as code, then you're going to have a problem maintaining that. Certainly across providers if you have to, but certainly it gives you that your maintenance becomes a different problem. It's not necessarily a better one, but we have found it to be an easier one to handle. It's a different problem. I've found it easier, and certainly if everyone's kind of on the same page, then it is easy enough to handle. Now, a little bit of a pros and cons, and some of these could be on this side, and I kind of tried to put them out. I think when you're looking at serverless, your pros are things like your ability to maintain. Actually, you have less to maintain, I think. Scale, the ability to scale is huge. Your cost, I think, comes down significantly from if you are starting with this, it's much, much easier to have a lower cost than if you're transferring from one thing to another. But I think if you just start doing new things, you'll find that the cost is much lower. You do end up with efficiencies. You don't necessarily end up with the best solution, but you do end up with efficiencies around the system. And if you're doing this with infrastructure as code, I've just found that to be a remarkable thing for allowing, for understanding your systems. You don't understand your systems when you've got a bunch of servers in quite the same way. You might feel like you do just because there's fewer of them, but actually I think that's a pro. And I think when you talk about security, and there are other people that are slightly better at this than I am, I think security is significantly improved. Doesn't completely get rid of all the problems, it adds new ones, but I think the problems that come in are better problems to have than the other ones. So cons are things like testing and infrastructure again. It's slightly more problematic because you've got a bigger thing. But you've also got the cons of other services and your providers, and having to consider your provider in this situation as well. So there are various different things that are good and bad. But for me, again, serverless value, for me, is about reducing maintenance. It's a total cost of ownership problem. It doesn't mean that your initial build is quicker. I think probably if you do it right, your initial build is a little slower, but your initial build is slower and your long-term view is significantly improved because you don't have to maintain various things. I used to say in a lot of my talks that I basically don't ever have to really think about it outside of work hours. And actually, we've found that in the last 18 months, we've hardly had to touch it outside work hours. There have been a couple of times it's errored and it's resolved itself, which is quite a nice thing to have happened. But for a startup, it's a hugely useful thing. And less maintenance means that you have more time to create new features. So it actually does allow you, I think, to move faster over the longer term. And when you're a CTO, that actually makes a big difference. So I'm kind of going to stop there and say thank you very much.
Awesome. We can probably do one if anyone's got
Anyone got one question? One question.
You mentioned engineering responsibility
Yep.
many times. What do you do to help encourage that?
What do I do to help encourage engineering responsibility? That's a good question. I would suggest, basically, if anyone uses the excuse, it works on my machine, they haven't done a good enough job. I think you just have to tell people that you can't just hide away behind that kind of conversation. You either ask someone if you don't know, it's a collaborative effort, but then you also say that the whole team fails. So if you're not teaching your team properly, or if you're not leading your team properly, it's a whole team responsibility. But also, if that's the excuse, you basically go to them and say, right, your dev procedure needs to change. You need to think and be more collaborative with other people. That's generally, I find that generally people who talk more about their code will generally find that problem much less. Don't know about anyone else, but anyway. Thank you very much.